We are on DAF Mem Zayin Amud Aleph, and I have to tell you that we're going to see a story now that I believe has tremendous depth, and that I don't understand the depth of the story. We'll just try and scratch the surface. We were talking yesterday about cannibalism, about if a person is sold to cannibals, there is a potential mitzvah of redeeming them from servitude. Not only a mitzvah of pidyon shvuyim, that goes without saying, but even ransoming them back if they are sold into slavery, because there's an issue of pikuach nefesh, even when there are certain instances when we would not sanction ransoming a person who is a habitual repeater, that he constantly sells himself into slavery to Gentiles, to idolaters. But in this case, we would sanction it just because you got to save the guy's life, because they're going to eat him if we don't save him. So, and the name for cannibals is Ludoi in the Gemara. Reish Lakish zavin nafshe leludoi. Reish Lakish was sold himself to slavery to the Ludites, and it's not clear why. Tosfos says that no one would do this if they were a Fruma Yid, if they were a God-fearing Talmud Chacham. And so this must have taken place before Reish Lakish became a Baal Tshuva, with the whole incident with Rabbi Yochanan. So, the truth is, because Reish Lakish was a criminal, it's not surprising that once in a while you get caught. And so he probably got sold into slavery because of some crime he had committed, some attempted thievery that was botched. Anyway, what did he do? He was a smart man. So shakal bahadei chayasa vigalgalta. He brought with him a sack that normally is used to carry very light things, but he hid inside the sack a very heavy stone. This will be relevant for the next part of the story. Amar Gemiri diyoma basra kol deboy minayu avdile kol hecha delechol adame. He says, we know that the custom of these Ludites is that the day before they're going to kill you to eat you, they give you one last request and they do everything that you want. They'll grant any request that you wish. Sort of like the last request that we do today when we take a prisoner is going to be executed. But here, the reason why they do it is that they'll appease you so that you'll submit yourself to execution without putting up a big fuss. And according to the Aruch, the meaning of this is that they do that because when you're at peace and you get executed, your blood is more tasty. Okay, so anyways, that's why, just something for you to store in your memory banks for the future. Anyway, Yoma Basra Amrulei Mai Nichalach. So it came to that last day. They were about to execute Reish Lakish to eat him, and they said, "What is your last request? What would you like?" So Amar Lahu Ba'ina Akamtinchu Va'osvinchu V'chol Chad Minaychu Amchei Chayasu Upalga. So he said, "I have a fetish. If you'll satisfy my fetish, what I'd like you to do is I want to tie you all up, and I want to sit you all down in a row, and then I want to hit you over the head with this little sack that I have." They thought it was just some kind of silly, game that he wanted to play before he dies. So they said, fine. So kamtinhu va'osvinhu kol chad minayhu kadmachye chad chayasa nafak nishmase. So that's what they did. They let themselves be tied up, and he takes this sack, and again it has this heavy stone in it, right? So when he whacks them over the head, their souls leave them. In other words, whether that means they literally die or they are stunned incredibly. And charkine l'shine, and one of them, it's not clear whether it's the first guy he hits or charkine l'shine means this fellow started rattling his teeth. And what that means is that he was so stunned that it looked like he was smiling. But he really wasn't smiling, he was just like so stunned that his mouth grimaced. So Amrlei achuchi kamachayches bi akati pashlach gabi palga de chayasa. He says, you're mocking me, you're laughing or smiling at me, so I still have a half of a whack, if that's what's going to take that smile off your face. So katlinu kulhu. So as a result of Reish Lakish's ruse, he was able to successfully kill them all. Nafak va'asa yasiv ka'achal v'shasi. So he escapes. He goes and he sits down and he eats and drinks. Now Rashi explains that it's not that he had a celebratory feast. What it means is that from that point onwards, for the rest of his life, he said, I've come with this close brush with death. I have a totally new attitude about life. I'm just going to indulge myself and eat and drink and be merry, because you never know if today's your last day. So Amrle brate lo bois midi le mizgale. So she sees him sitting on the floor and eating. So she says, Father, don't you want a pillow or something else to sit on? So Amrla biti crazy kari. He said, no, it's okay, daughter. My stomach is my cushion. In other words, he was overweight. He was, he had a big belly, and he said, I don't need anything. I think that this is a statement that is meant to be interpreted as Reish Lakish said, from now on I'm self-sufficient. I'm taking care of number one. It's just me. It's me against the world. That was Reish Lakish's attitude after this occurred. Kinach nafshe shava kava demorika. And when he died, he only left over. He had no assets because he basically consumed everything, lived for the day. And all he left over was one kav of saffron. It's a valuable spice, but it's not a significant amount. And kora anafshe va'azvu la'acherim chelam. And he recited about himself this pasuk in Tehillim that says that the righteous and the wicked die the same way, and they end up leaving their wealth for other people. So, in other words, basically he was saying, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, is the same idea. There's no point in accumulating tremendous wealth and saving it, because you're just going to pass it on to somebody else. Now, what this story means is very difficult to understand. I believe, and I only have a very, very blurry insight to this, I believe that this Gemara is telling us this was the precursor to Reish Lakish's encounter to Rabbi Yochanan, meaning that he had a life-altering experience, this brush with death, where he was almost a dinner for these ludois. He narrowly escaped, and he came to the realization, sort of an epiphany, I guess, about what the purpose of living, what the meaning of life was. And in some way, he basically says, I have to take care of myself. In his initial thinking, he's got to take care of himself physically. But as he gets to mature a little bit more and he meets up with Rabbi Yochanan, eventually he's going to realize that not only do I have to take care of myself physically, I've got to take care of myself spiritually as well, because no one else is going to do it for me. There's a lot more depth to this story, and I'm sure there's a lot more to the metaphors included with the 1.5 wax and the guy smiling at him, but we'll have to go weiter. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. Hamocher es sadehu la'obi kochavim lokeach umevi mimenu bikur mipnei tikun ha'olam. The Mishnah now says that we know that it's usher for a Jew to sell real estate in Eretz Yisrael to a goy. You're treating the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael in a deprecating way by just disposing of it and giving it over to an idolater. If you do so, the rabbis made a takana that even though the land technically is not yours anymore, you still have an obligation to annually take the first fruits from that field and bring it as bikurim to the temple, even though it's not yours anymore. But this is sort of like a takana that the Chachamim made as a way of disincentivizing you from divesting land and giving it over to an idolater. The Gemara now says, Omar Rabba, Afal pisha in kinyan la'obe kochavim be'eretz Yisrael la'havkia midei meiser, shene'amar ki li ha'aretz, li kedushas ha'aretz, aval yesh kinyan la'obe kochavim be'eretz Yisrael, lach borba boro shichin u'ma'aros, shene'amar hashamayim shamayim la'Hashem, v'ha'aretz nasan livnei adam. So Rabbah comes up with a very interesting statement. Now, this is an independent discussion, independent of our Mishnah. He says, I contend that if you sell property to an idolater in Eretz Yisrael, you have not removed the kedusha of the inherent kedusha in the land, such that whatever produce is harvested from that property is still subject to trumas and maasros, because the kedusha still remains and it's still sort of considered to be subject to all of the laws. However, what the goy is allowed to do, since he's legally purchased it, he's allowed to make alterations to the physical landscape of the property. He's allowed to dig, he's allowed to construct, he's allowed to do whatever he wishes, because the land is his. So on the one hand, we have a pasuk of Kili Haaretz, the land belongs to me, says Hashem. It retains its kedusha. But because of the other pasuk that says V'haaretz nasan livnei adam, that God gives the land to mankind, the Gentile does have rights to the land as far as the physical rights to the land. But now we have the opposite opinion of Rebbe Lazar. Rebbe Lazar Omer Afal Pi Sheyesh Kinyan La'obi Kochavim Beretz Yisrael Hafkia Midei Meiser Shenamar Deganecha V'lo Degan Ove Kochavim Aval Ein Kinyan La'obi Kochavim Beretz Yisrael Lachbor Ba'boros Shichin Uma'aros Shenamar Lashem Ha'aretz. He says mamash just the opposite. He says a Gentile, when he acquires real estate in Eretz Yisrael, does remove the kedusha of the produce such that anything that grows on that property is no longer subject to trumos and ma'asos. And why is that? Because the Torah, in describing the law of tithing, says deganecha, it has to be your Jewish grain. But if it's not your Jewish grain, it's Gentile grain, it's not subject to that law. But it is considered to be still the Kedushas Hashem's land, in that a goy may not make physical alterations to the land. So it's exactly the opposite of Rabbah. So the Gemara now asks, B'mai kamiflagi, what is the machlokas? In other words, what is the basis of the machlokas? Mar savar deganecha v'lo degan ovei kochavim, Amar savar digunecha v'lo digun ovei kochavim. The machlokas is, how do you read that word deganecha in the pasuk that talks about tithing? So the way that Rebbe Lazar looks at it is very, very straightforward. The Torah says only the Jews' produce is subject to tithes, but not a Gentile's produce. So if he owns the property, it's not subject to tithes. But Rabbi looks at it differently. Rabbi says the word deganecha means at the time of digun, which means at the time when the grain has been processed and has had what we call miruach hakri, where there's been a stockpiling of the grain in the threshing floor. The grain's processing is finished. At that point is when you look at the ownership of the grain. It's not, the criterion is not who is the owner of the property. The criterion is who is the owner of the grain at that moment when it has been processed and stockpiled in the granary. So according to Rabbah, if let's say a Jew owns the land where the grain is growing, and then he sells it to a Gentile in its raw form before it's been processed, and the Gentile processes it and stockpiles it, so then it's patur from Trumas and Maestros. But it's got nothing to do with who owns the property. It's got to do with who owns it at that moment when it's processed and subject to tithing. So that's the way Rabbi looks at that pasuk, and therefore he says, even if a Gentile owns real estate in Eretz Yisrael, it will still be subject to tithing in the event that a Jew purchases the grain from him, and processes it and stockpiles it. So Amar Rabba Mina Aminallah. So Rabba says, how can I prove this to you? How can I prove that a Gentile's property is still subject to tithes? How can I show this to you? Did not. I'll show you from a Mishnah in Maseches Peah. It says, Haleket ve'hashichacha ve'hapeah shel ovei kochavim chayavin b'maiser ela imkein hivkir. That if leket shichacha and peah are accumulated and they belong to an oved kochavim, now leket shichacha and peah are the gleanings that a person is supposed to leave in his field for the poor. Now, if a Gentile has that, so then they're still subject to meiser, unless the Gentile declares it to be hefker. Now we have to explain it. There's a little bit of vagary here. Heichi dami, what's the case? Ilema di Yisrael v'laktino oved kochavim. If you're going to tell me that we're talking about a Jew owns the field, he's the landowner, he leaves over gleanings of leket shichacha and peah, and a Gentile poor man comes and takes those gleanings, and you're going to tell me that what? What's the law? The law is that the Gentile has to tithe them unless the Jew already made them hefker. So Eli imkein hefker hamafkeri v'kaimi. So how can that possibly be? The Jew already, by definition, has already made them hefker. Because what's the law? When I set aside my gleanings for the poor, I've de facto declared them to be hefker. That's why the poor are allowed to take them. So how can that be the interpretation of the Mishnah, that the Jew has to again make them hefker? That doesn't make any sense. So elalav da obe kochavim v'laktinu Yisrael. So the way you understand the Mishnah is that the field belongs to a Gentile, and the Gentile voluntarily, even though he's not chayiv in mitzvahs, he voluntarily decides, you know what, the minhag in the land of Israel is for people to leave gleanings for the poor. I'll do the same thing. So he leaves gleanings for the poor, and a Jewish poor man comes to his field and picks up the gleanings, and it says, "Time to hifker, hello hifker chayiv." And yet we learn that what? If the Gentile declared the leket shichan peah to be hefker, so then the Jew does not have to tithe it. But if the Gentile did not declare it hefker, because let's say he doesn't know the laws of leket shichan peah, he's not chayiv in that mitzvah, so he just leaves gleanings. If the Jew takes it, he has to take meiser, because then it's actually a gift that the Gentile's giving to the Jew, not an act of hefker. But what do you see from here? That produce that is acquired from a Gentile field is subject to trumas and meisus, is subject to tithing. So this proves Rabbi's point that the kedusha of the produce is still inheres in the produce. So the Gemara says, "Lo la'olam di Yisrael v'liktinu ove kolchavim." You know, perhaps you're misinterpreting the Mishnah. Really, the Mishnah is talking about a case where the field is owned by a Jew, and a Gentile came and he picks up the gleanings. So then your question was, well, then why does the Jew have to re-mafkir it? Why does he have to redeclare it to be hefker if, when he left the peah in the first place, that was de facto a declaration of hefker for the poor? The Gemara answers, I'll tell you why. He says, because nihi de mafkiri adaita de Yisrael adaita dove kolchavim mi mafkiri. The point is like this. The Mishnah is telling me that if this Gentile poor man were to go ahead and take the gleanings and then want to sell them back to a Jew, the Jew would have to tithe them. What about the fact that they were already made hefker, and hefker is pater from meiser? The answer is because when the landowner declared them to be hefker as peah, he only made them hefker with the understanding that the people who were going to come and take from that hefker were going to be Jews. He never made it hefker with the intent that it should be picked up by non-Jews. Now, Tosfos points out that it's not that we're suggesting that you can make something hefker for some people and not hefker for other people. That's not what we're saying. What we are suggesting, though, is that hefker b'tos is not hefker. Now, what that means is that let's say I declare something hefker under the pretense that through my declaration of hefker, a Jewish poor person will come along and take it. So, and then lo and behold, an animal eats it, or a non-Jew comes and picks it up. In that situation, we could say that was hefker b'tos, and the hefker is null and void. That's what we're suggesting. We're suggesting, therefore, that in this situation, the declaration of hefker was done in error, and therefore the Gentiles, it is now the Gentile owns the produce, but not because it was made hefker. It really is coming from a Jew, and if he therefore transfers it over to another Jew, that other Jew would have to tithe it now because it comes from a Jew's property.
You can break up the hefker. You can say so. You can do that. I thought it was just hefters.
Okay, so I went through this whole statement in order to deflect what your question.
I know, but you can do that. The mice, you can do it.
No, you can't. That's exactly what I just said. You can't make something hefker for one person and not for another person, right? Right. Okay. So Tashma, Yisrael shalokach sadeh me'obed kolchavim ad shelo hevia shlish v'chazar u'machro lo mishehevia shlish chayeves ma'aser. Let's look at another brayso, and we want to try and prove whether the law is like Rabba or like Rabbi Lazar. Does produce from a Gentile field, is it subject to Trumas and Maisus or not? So let's look at the following case. A Jew buys a field from an idolater, and he buys it at a stage where the grain that's growing has not yet grown a third of its way, so it's not yet subject to the laws of tithing. He then goes ahead and sells it back to the idolater after it has already grown to a third of its growth, which means that while it was in the Jew's possession, it reached that stage of maturity that it would be subject to tithes. So then, chayeves b'maiser shekvar nischayeva. So the Brisa says it's subject to tithes because when it grew its third of its growth, it became subject to tithes in the possession of a Jew. The Gemara says, you see from here that what? Nischayva in lo nischayva lo. This seems to be a support of Rabbi Lazar, that if it's in the possession of a Gentile at the time of its maturity, so then it's not subject to tithes. not like Rabbi had said. So the Gemara says, Hacha b'may askina, no. You'd have to explain, according to Rabbi, that Bryce is talking about Besuria, u'kesaver kibush yachid lo shemei kibush. That this is talking about not the produce growing in Eretz Yisrael proper, but produce growing in an annexed portion of Eretz Yisrael, such as Syria, which was conquered by King David, and there's a difference of opinion whether that annexed real estate has the same Kedushas Haaretz as the rest of Eretz Yisrael does or not. This brisa holds that it does not have Kedushas Haaretz, and only rabbinically did the rabbis require it to be tithed, but they only placed that requirement upon Jewish-owned real estate in Syria, not in Gentile-owned real estate. And that's the reason why it's patur from Meiser, unless a Jew owned it in that interim period when it reached its maturity. Tashma, let's look at another brisa. Yisrael v'kochavim shalak chusada b'shutfus. You have tevel v'chulin muravim zebazeh divrei Rabbi, and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel omer shal v'kochavim parta v'shal Yisrael chayev. Here's a machlokes in the following situation: a Jew and a Gentile own a piece of real estate in Eretz Yisrael, 50-50 partners. So any produce that grows from that farm, so according to Rabbi, you have basically every single kernel of grain is 50% tevel, which means it's subject to tithing, and 50% chulin, which means it's exempt from tithing. And so therefore, even after they split the grain, every single kernel that belongs to the Gentile is 50-50, and every single kernel that belongs to the Jew is 50-50, such that regardless of whether you buy it from the Gentile or whether you buy it from the Jew, you have to tithe. And also when you tithe, when the Jew tithes his portion, he can't tithe from another part of his produce that's 100% tevel, because this is a unique situation where only 50% of each kernel is tevel, so you can only tithe from this produce onto itself. That's according to Rebbe. However, Reb Shimon Gamliel disagrees, and he says that when they split the grain, so then we use the principle of Breira to say that whatever 50% the Gentile gets is retroactively indicated as being the non-tithable, not subject to tithes produce, and whatever the Jew obtains is the tevel, is the subject to tithing produce. Now, ad kan lo pligi ela demar saver yesh breira, mar saver ein breira. The only machlokas between Rebbe and Shimon Gamliel is, do we apply the principle of breira or not to determine the status of the grain in the possession of the Jew and the non-Jew? But everyone agrees, aval dekuli alma yesh kinyan lo b'kochavim be'eretz Yisrael afkiya miyad meiser. But everyone seems to agree, both Rabbi and Shimon Gamliel, that what? That only 50% of the grain is subject to tithes, because the portion that's owned by the Gentile is not subject to tithes. So it's a kasha again on Rabbah. The Gemara says here too, Hachanami b'Surya uksaver kibush yachid lo shmei kibush. We'll give you the same answer. We're not talking about property in Eretz Yisrael proper. We're talking about property in Syria, which was conquered by King David. It's only subject to tithes midrabanan because it was conquered by an individual king and not annexed by divine command by the entire nation of Israel, and therefore it's only subject to tithes midrabanan, but a Gentile who owns it is not subject to tithing at all. Okay, but in Eretz Yisrael proper, Rabbah would still maintain that even if it was grown in a Gentile's property, it's subject to tithes. Amar Reb Chia bar Abin Tashma, Hamocher Sadei Lo'obi Kochavim Lokeachu Mevi Bikormim Neitikan Ha'olam. Now let's take a look at our Mishnah. Our Mishnah had said that if a Jew sells his land to a Gentile, as a rabbinic enactment, the Jew is obligated to take bikurim every year, even after he sold it, and bring those bikurim up to Yerushalayim. Now, this indicates it's only a rabbinic law, but biblically it no longer belongs to the Jew, and it seems that it's patur from bikurim. So the Gemara's question is, this is again a challenge on Rabbah, because according to you, Rabbah, if a Jew sells his property to a Gentile, it still maintains its status as being holy property, and still like sort of attached to the Jew who was the prior owner, and the Jew would have to bring bikurim midioraisa. But our Mishnah doesn't say that midioraisa he has to bring that produce; it only says midrabanan. Now notice that Rashi points out something very important. We're not suggesting, no one's suggesting that if a Jew sells his property to a Gentile, that the Jew has to tithe has to bring Trumas and Maestros. The only suggestion is that he has to bring Bikurim. What's the difference between Trumas and Maestros and Bikurim? Trumas and Maestros, even if I own property with produce growing, I only have to tithe it if I want to consume it or I want to sell it. But let's say I have produce, I have wheat growing, and I don't need it. I don't need it. I'll let the animals eat it. Let it rot on the stalks. Who cares about it? Is there any obligation to tithe? No, there's no obligation to tithe. So there, we're not suggesting that if a Jew sells his property, the Jew would still have to tithe it. That's only when it's a question of owning a commodity that is marketable that you have to tithe it. But Bikurim is different. Bikurim is the law that if you have first fruits, regardless of whether you want to consume them or not, the Torah still obligates the Jew to bring those first fruits to the temple. So therefore, even if I've sold it to a Gentile, if the land retains its inherent Kedusha, then the Jew should be obligated to take those Bikurim to the temple every year. And yet we see it's only Midrabanan, it's not Midoraisa. So that's a kasha again on Rabbah. So the Gemara says, Amar Ravashi shtei takanos havu. So Ravashi says, no, you're misunderstanding the Mishnah. Really, according to our Mishnah Midoraisa, the land is subject to Bikurim, right? But why did they only say Mipnei Tikkun Ha'olam? Because the enactment came in two stages. Meikara havu ma'isi midioraisa, kevin dechazu dekamakri umezavni desavri bikdusha sayu kayomin takinu lahu delolesu. So originally the rabbis wanted to disincentivize holy Jews from selling their property to Gentiles. So what they said was like this: listen. They saw that Jews had this following attitude. They said, listen, even after I sell the property to a Gentile, I still have to bring Bikurim. That shows that the land still has Kedusha. So what's the big deal? If I sell it to a Gentile, I'll still treat it with Kedusha. I'll bring the Bikurim to Yerushalayim. I'll read the Parsha of Bikurim. I'll do the whole ceremony, and it still has the same sanctity. So what's the big deal? The rabbis saw that people were not hesitating to sell property to Gentiles. They wanted to put a stop to it. So here's what they did.
There's no Isser connected with that sale.
Well, there is, but this was not something. I don't know if it's a formal Isser. I don't know if it's. There may be a formal Isser of Lo Sechanem, but I don't know whether the Gemara is maintaining that. It seems from the language of the Gemara that the rabbis wanted to disincentivize people because people felt that there was no Isser. So they therefore stepped in and they said, listen, Chaver, from now on, if you sell your property to a Gentile, from now on, you cannot bring Bikurim. They felt that, a holy Jew would say, you mean I'm divesting the Kedusha from that property by selling it to a Goy, so that'll disincentivize a Jew from selling it to a Gentile. However, the generation started to degrade. Kevin dechazu demandelo sagile mazban v'kamishtakan be'arovdei kolchavim. They saw that wasn't working. They saw that when Jews were needy, they would still sell their property to Gentiles, and they would leave it in their hands and basically say, "No, I got to make a living." Right? So hadar takinu lehu deleisu. They therefore modified their takan and said, "Okay, go back to the biblical law, which is that you should bring bikurim. You should bring bikurim again."
So I understand, if it's midraisa, how can they say they didn't have to bring it?
Because we know that the Chachamim have the power to b'sheva al taisa. They have the power to tell you not to do a mitzvah. Like they can tell you not to blow shofar, right?
So the second takana was that you should bring it because then they were on a lower level. They didn't want to lose.
That's right. So they're on the lower level. Right. On the lower level, this was now saying that, listen, if you sell it to a Gentile, you're still going to have the hassle of bringing the Bikurim to Yerushalayim. Before it was a great Zechus, and they felt that at least they're not forfeiting the kedusha of the land by selling it to a Gentile, because look, we get to still bring Bikurim, but then they saw people just took a totally different attitude. Itmar, okay. Hamocher sadeu lepeiros. Now we have an interesting machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish that's related to this. What if I sell to a Jew? Now we're not talking about a Gentile anymore. I sell a Jew my property, but for a limited amount of time. So it's basically a land lease. I lease my property to a Jew for 10 years, and he owns the property. He gets to work the farm, and the produce belongs to him for 10 years. So the question is like this. Vis-a-vis the laws of Bikurim, does the person who's leased the property, is he the owner so that he can bring bikurim and even recite the parsha that you're supposed to bring when you say when you bring bikurim, which is the Esa Aretz Asher Nasata Li Hashem, that I give thanks to you, Hashem, for this land that you have given to me. Now, can he really say that if the land is only leased to him, but it doesn't really belong to him inherently? So Rabbi Yochanan Amar Mevi v'Korei Reish Lakish Amar Mevi ve'Eino Korei. Rabbi Yochanan says you can go ahead and bring the bikurim and even recite that parsha. And Reish Lakish says, no, Mevi ve'Eino Korei. No, you can't recite that parsha. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Mevi v'Korei Kinyan Peres Kekinyan Aguf Dami. Reish Lakish Amar Mevi ve'Eino Korei Kinyan Peres Lav Kekinyan Aguf Dami. And the machlokus is an acquisition of the produce of the land, the utility of the soil, like ownership, or is it not like ownership? Rabbi Yochanan says it's like ownership, so therefore you can say that God, you gave me the land, even though I know I have to return it in 10 years. Reish Lakish says it's not ownership. The other guy really holds the title, his name is on the title, you're only there as the renter, and therefore you can't say Asher Nasata Li Hashem, that you gave me the land. So Eisvei Rabbi Yochanan LaReish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan challenges Reish Lakish's assertion that you can't read the parsha. The Torah says, you shall do this for the land, for your land, ulaveisecha, and you shall do it for your household. You shall rejoice in all the goodness that Hashem has given to you and to your household. Now, what does the word household mean? This teaches me that even the land that my wife brought into the marriage, which we call nichse milug, which means the husband is not the owner technically, he only has the kinyan peiros, he only has rights of consumption of the land, but he still gets to bring bikurim and he gets to recite the parsha. So what do you see from here, says Rabbi Yochanan, that a kinyan peiros, a lease, so to speak, is enough for you to be able to recite the parsha. So Amarle Shiny Hasam Dichsivu Leveisechas. Reish Lakish says no, that's a special rule for a wife that brings in property, but anyone else who gives you property with just the kinyan peiros, you can't say Asher Nasatali, you can't recite the parsha. So the Ika da Amri, and some learn it just the other way around, that Eisvei Reish Lakish LaRabbi Yochanan, Ulaveisecha melamed shadamevi bikuri ishto v'karei hasam hu dichsiv ulaveisecha val ba'al malo. That Reish Lakish's argument is, look at the pasuk. It says only for your wife, when she lets you have the kinyan peiros on the property, do you get to recite the parsha. But if someone else gives you a kinyan peiros on their property, you don't get to recite the parsha. So it's a kasha on you, Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan's answer was no. Amar lei taimadi dinami mehacha ka'amina. I'm looking at that same pasuk, Reish Lakish, and I'm saying like this, that it's a binyan av to all cases. Just like with your wife, you only have a kinyan peiros, and that's sufficient to let you recite the parsha. So too with any property that you acquire where there's a kinyan peiros, you can recite the parsha, because a kinyan peiros is ownership. So Eisvei. Now let's ask another kasha. Haya baba derech ubikure ishto biyado v'shama shemesa ishto mevi v'kore. There's a brisa that says as follows: a man is taking bikurim from his wife's property that he has a kinyan peiros on, right? And he then hears on the road, your wife has passed away. So the halacha is, he continues on his path. The story reminds me of the guy who's on the having a golf game, and a hearse drives by, and he stops playing for a minute to salute the hearse. And the guy say, "Wow, we didn't know you were such a sensitive guy." He says, "Well, we were married for 25 years." So this is a guy who hears his wife has passed away. He's got her fruits. So he doesn't go home for the lavaya. He says, "Listen, I'm oisek b'mitzvah. I got to bring my bikurim." So he keeps on going on his journey, right? So But the thing is that the brisa says he can't recite the parsha of bikurim anymore. So I'm sorry. He does recite the parsha of bikurim because his wife has passed away. Now, what happens when a man's wife passes away? He inherits her property. So it sounds like the only reason he's allowed to recite the parsha of bikurim is because he's the owner of the land. But before then, he wouldn't have been able to. So mesa in lo, mesa lo. So isn't that a kasha to everyone who says, isn't that certainly a kasha to Rabbi Yochanan, who says that if you have a kinyan peiros, you can recite the parsha? So the Gemara says no. Hu hadin da'afal gav delo mesa u'mesa itzrichale. Really, you would recite the parsha even if your wife is still alive. But there's a chiddush here, that even though there's been a change of ownership in the interim from the time that you picked up the basket of fruits to the time that you deliver it to Yerushalayim, because you might have thought, Salka daita chamina ligzor mishum de Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina, because you might have thought that this is akin to the law of Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina, where a person doesn't recite the parsha. The Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina, batzun v'shagan biyad shaliach umei shaliach baderech, mevi ve'eno korei, shene'emar v'lokachta ve'heveisa ad shetehe lakicha ve'hava be'echad kamash malan. Because I would have thought like this: a man takes bikurim, and he gives it to his proxy to take the basket to Yerushalayim. Now, in that case, a proxy never recites the parsha because the produce is not his; it belongs to his sender. So, therefore, he can't say Asher Nasata Li Hashem, that you gave it to me. You gave it to my sender. So the question is like this: what if the proxy dies en route to Yerushalayim, and the master says, "You know what? I'm going to catch up with my dead shaliach, and I'll take the basket myself to Yerushalayim." Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina says that even though the fellow is carrying his own produce to Yerushalayim, he can no longer recite the parsha. Why? Because the Torah connects the verb of taking the basket to bringing the basket to Yerushalayim. Only when the same person who has picked up the basket is taking the basket to Yerushalayim can you recite the parsha of Bikurim. I might have thought that because there's been a change in ownership in this produce, or in the land that this produce came from, that when I picked up the basket, the property was my wife's, and now when I transport the basket to Yerushalayim, there's been a shift, a transition. Therefore, it should be like Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina's halacha that anytime there's a transition between the picking up and the delivery, you don't recite the parsha. Kamash malan, that's not the case. That's the chiddush. But the truth is, you recite the parsha bikurim whether your wife is alive or whether your wife is deceased. Now, the Gemara then says, we'll do this very quickly, Va'azdu l'taymayu, that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are consistent, because not only do they disagree about a case where you give, let's say, a 10-year lease to a person to have your property, but they discuss this, and by the way, Rashi says that that's talking about a case where the laws of Yovel are no longer extant. In order for the laws of Yovel to be extant, such that the property reverts to its original owner in the year 50, you have to have 12 tribes of Israel living on the land. If you have some of the tribes that have already been exiled, the laws of Yovel no longer apply. So even, let's say, towards the end of the First Temple era, after Sancheriv exiled some of the tribes, the laws of Yovel were no longer extant. So let's look now at a case where the laws of Yovel are extant. So the Itmar Hamocher Sadeu Bizmansha Yovel Noe, that if a person sells his property when Yovel is extant, and therefore the seller and the buyer both know that the land is going to revert back to the original owner at year 50, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Mevi v'Korei Reish Lakish Amar Mevi ve'eno Korei. So Rabbi Yochanan says the buyer can still bring Bikurim and recite the parsha of Bikurim because he has the Kinyan Peiros. And Reish Lakish says, no, he can bring the produce, but he doesn't recite the parsha. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Mevi v'Korei Kinyan Peiros Kinyan Aguf Dami. Reish Lakish Amar Mevi ve'eno Korei Kinyan Peiros Lavke Kinyan Aguf Dami. And it's the exact same machlokas. Rabbi Yochanan says you can bring the Peiros and recite the parsha because owning the produce, owning the soil for its produce is enough ownership to say Hashem Asata Li Hashem, that you've given it to me. And Reish Lakish says, no, you're not the owner, and therefore you can't say Asher Nasata Li, you can't recite the parsha. So now the question is, well then why do you need the machlokas in both places? If they've stated the halacha in a case where Yovel is not extant, but it's a temporary lease, so then and that machlokas applies there, then why do you have to state it again in the case where Yovel is extant, which is really conceptually the same thing? It's a 49-year lease. So the itmar behahi kamer Reish Lakish dechi kanachis adaita de pera kanachis aval bahach de adaita de gufe kanachis emamodi leila Rabbi Yochanan. The way I'm understanding the machlokas is as follows. The statement of the Gemara, and I could be mistaken, but I'm understanding it as follows. Perhaps the only time that Reish Lakish holds that you don't recite the parsha of Bikurim is only when Yovel is extant. Why? Because since every buyer in all of Eretz Yisrael, whenever you buy real estate, it's clear that you're only buying it for its peiros, and it's going to revert back during the Yovel, then there's not that commitment to ownership in anyone's mind, because the whole mindset of the entire country is that everything is temporary. And maybe only there does Reish Lakish say that you don't recite the parsha. But let's say Yovel is no longer extant, and real estate purchases are if they are done properly, can have finality, and the buyer would really own the property, then maybe the attitude of a person who buys it for 10 years is, well, during those 10 years, I'm mamish the owner, and Reish Lakish would therefore agree to Rabbi Yochanan that in that case, when Yovel is no longer extant, you could recite the parsha of Bikurim. So that's why we had to say it in that case. V'i itmar beha kamer Rabbi Yochanan aval bahachim amodel Reish Lakish tzricha. And if I only had the machlokes cited in the case where Yovel is not extant, maybe the only reason why Rabbi Yochanan insists that you do recite the parsha of Bikurim is again because of that mindset that real estate sales and purchases can have finality. Therefore, Rabbi Yochanan says even a 10-year lease would entitle the buyer to recite the parsha of Bikurim. But in a situation where Yovel is extant, and the whole mentality of the entire country is that everything is temporary and you only have a kinyan peiros, maybe there Rabbi Yochanan would agree with Reish Lakish and you don't recite the parsha. Kamash Malan, that's why you need both cases. It's something that the machlokus extends both when Yovel is extant and when Yovel is not extant. We'll hold it here. Have a wonderful Shabbos and Erev Shabbat.